There are moments in history that are not just events, but warnings carved into time. Moments that refuse to fade because they carry a message far greater than the people who lived through them. And one of those moments begins with a man who stood at the height of power, surrounded by wealth, control, and absolute authority. A man who looked at his kingdom and believed there was nothing above him, nothing beyond him, nothing greater than him. That man was Pharaoh. His arrogance did not appear overnight. It grew slowly, step by step. Power turned into pride. Pride turned into delusion. Until one day he crossed a line no human being should ever cross. He did not just claim authority over people. He claimed divinity itself. He declared, "I am your Lord, the Most High." These were not just words. They were a challenge to truth itself. And among the oppressed, among those who had no power, no voice, and no protection, there was a man chosen for a mission. Not with armies, not with weapons, but with truth. That man was Musa, peace be upon him. He stood before Pharaoh not as a rival but as a messenger, calling him back, reminding him of something simple yet powerful. No matter how high a person rises, he remains a servant, never a god. But Pharaoh refused, not because he did not understand, but because his pride would not allow him to accept. Because sometimes the greatest barrier to truth is not ignorance, it is ego. The message was clear, the signs were shown, but his heart only grew harder. Even miracles did not soften him, because when arrogance takes control, even truth feels like a threat. And then came the moment everything would change. Pharaoh gathered his forces, driven by anger, driven by denial. He chased Musa and those who believed with him, step by step, moving toward a destiny he could not escape, until they reached the edge of the sea. Behind them, a tyrant with an army. In front of them, an endless body of water. From a human perspective, there was no way out. No escape, no solution. But then, something happened that would be remembered forever. By the command of Allah, the sea split. A path appeared where there was none. Walls of water rose on both sides, silent and powerful. And through that path, Musa and his people walked, step by step, not in fear but in trust. And Pharaoh followed, not with faith, but with arrogance, still believing that nothing could stop him, still convinced that his power was enough. But it wasn't. Because the path that was opened for truth was never meant for falsehood. And as soon as he entered, everything changed. The same sea that had become a path became a prison. The walls began to close. The illusion of control shattered. And in that final moment, when truth became undeniable, Pharaoh spoke. Not with pride, not with power, but with fear. He declared belief. But it was too late. Because there comes a moment when realization no longer changes destiny. A moment when truth is seen clearly, but cannot be acted upon. And the waters closed over him. Silence followed. But the story did not end there. Because this was not just the fall of a tyrant. This was a message, a warning, a sign that would not disappear with time. Pharaoh did not simply vanish into history. His end was preserved as a lesson. A reminder that power without humility leads to destruction. That arrogance blinds even the strongest. That no matter how high a person rises, there is always a limit he cannot cross. And this is where the story becomes personal. Because Pharaoh is not only a man from the past. He is a reflection, a symbol, a warning about what happens when a person places himself at the center of everything. Ignoring truth, ignoring guidance, ignoring limits. And as you think about those final moments, when everything he believed in collapsed in an instant, a question begins to rise. Quiet but powerful. How many times does a person ignore the truth while there is still time? How many times do we delay change, thinking there will always be another chance, until one day, there isn't? And that is the real warning. Because the story of Pharaoh is not just about what happened. It is about what continues to happen. Every day, in choices, in direction, in what we follow. And it leaves you with one question. When the truth becomes undeniable, will you accept it in time? Or only when it is too late? But the story does not end beneath the water, because what happened after is what turns this moment into something unforgettable, something that continues to speak across time even to those who never witnessed it. When the waves settled and the sea returned to its calm, something remained, something that was never meant to disappear, because while many before him had fallen and vanished into history, Pharaoh was not allowed to simply be forgotten. His body was preserved, not as an honor but as a sign. A warning that would travel across generations, reaching people who would never see his kingdom, never hear his voice, yet would still be able to witness the result of his arrogance. And this is where the story becomes even more powerful, because centuries passed, civilizations changed, the world moved forward, yet the sign remained, waiting for a time when it would be uncovered and understood. And that time eventually came. People began to discover what had been hidden, and among those discoveries was the body of Pharaoh, preserved in a way that defied expectation, recognizable, visible, and untouched by the complete disappearance that usually follows death. And this was not random, because long before this moment, it had already been declared that his body would be saved as a sign for those who come after him, not to glorify him, but to expose the end of arrogance and the reality of truth. Today people can stand in front of what remains of him, not in fear of his power but in reflection of his fall. Because what once claimed to be untouchable has become silent, what once demanded obedience can no longer speak, and what once stood at the height of control now stands as a reminder of how quickly everything can collapse when it is built on the wrong foundation. And this changes the way the story is felt. Because it is no longer something distant, no longer just words passed from one generation to another, it becomes something real, something almost visible, something that forces a deeper reflection. And when a warning is only heard, it can be ignored, but when it is seen even indirectly, it becomes harder to escape, harder to dismiss, and harder to forget. Pharaoh had everything a person could desire: power, wealth, control, authority, a name that commanded obedience and a presence that no one dared to challenge. Yet none of it saved him. Not his army, not his status, not his certainty in himself, because when truth arrives, nothing false can stand against it, no matter how strong it appears in the moment. And this is where the story becomes personal again. Because the same mindset still exists today, not in the same form and not with the same words, but with the same essence, people placing themselves at the center, believing they are in control, living as if there are no limits, no accountability, and no return. And slowly, without even realizing it, they begin to walk a path that feels powerful at the beginning, but always leads to the same end. This is why his body was not erased. Because if he had disappeared completely, the lesson might have faded, the story might have become distant, something easy to ignore or doubt, but a preserved sign removes that distance. It brings the warning closer, it makes the message feel real in a way that cannot be easily dismissed. And that leads to a question. Not about him but about you. Because if someone with that level of power could fall so completely, what does that say about the rest of us, about the things we rely on, the things we trust, the things we believe will protect us? And this is where the realization becomes deeper. Because it shows that nothing external can truly secure a person. Not wealth, not status, not recognition, not the approval of others, because all of these things can disappear in a moment. Only truth remains. Only what is real holds its ground. Only a heart that is not blinded by ego can stay steady when everything else begins to collapse. And when you begin to understand this, the story changes. It is no longer just history, it becomes a mirror, a reflection of choices, of direction, of what you are building your life around, and that reflection asks something simple but powerful. If everything you rely on was taken away, what would remain? Because in the end, that is what defines a person, not what they had, but what they were built on. And Pharaoh's story stands as a clear and undeniable example of what happens when that foundation is wrong. And as this realization begins to settle more deeply, something shifts from simply understanding the story to recognizing its reflection in real life. Because the story of Pharaoh is not only about a man from the past, it is about a pattern that continues in quieter, more subtle ways within people today, a pattern that does not always appear as open arrogance, but often hides behind confidence, success, and the belief that one is always right. And this is where it begins, not suddenly and not loudly, but gradually, as a person starts to rely more on their own judgment without questioning it, starts to feel less need for guidance, and becomes more certain that they already see things clearly. At first it feels harmless, feels like strength, like independence, like control. But slowly something changes. Because the more a person follows only their own perspective, the less space remains for truth to enter. And when that space becomes smaller, it becomes easier to ignore what does not align with what they want to believe. Even when the truth is clear. Even when it is right in front of them. And this is exactly what happened to Pharaoh. He was shown signs that could not be denied, yet he did not reject them out of confusion. He rejected them because they challenged his position, his authority, and the image he had built of himself. And when a person becomes attached to that image, protecting it begins to matter more than accepting what is real. And that is where the danger grows. Because life slowly becomes centered around maintaining an image instead of seeking truth, around being seen as right instead of actually being right, and around defending oneself instead of reflecting honestly. And this shift does not feel dramatic, it feels normal, it blends into daily behavior, into small reactions, into the way a person responds when they are corrected or questioned. And over time this pattern builds. The heart becomes less responsive, less sensitive, less willing to pause, until one day ignoring truth no longer feels wrong. It feels natural. And that is the most dangerous point. Because when something wrong begins to feel normal, it becomes almost invisible, and a person can continue moving forward without realizing how far they have drifted. Pharaoh did not see himself as mistaken, he saw himself as justified, as powerful, as untouchable, and that belief stayed with him until the very last moment, until everything around him collapsed and the truth became undeniable. But by then it was too late. And this is where the story becomes more than history, it becomes a warning that reaches into the present, showing that a person can be surrounded by truth and still reject it, can see clear signs and still turn away, not because they do not understand but because they choose not to accept. And that choice is what defines everything. Because truth is not forced upon the heart, it is welcomed, and if the heart is closed, even the clearest guidance will not enter. So the question is not whether truth exists. The question is whether you are willing to accept it. And that is not always easy. Because accepting truth often requires letting go of pride, letting go of control, letting go of the version of yourself that feels comfortable but may not be correct. And this is where many people struggle because change feels difficult, reflection feels uncomfortable, and admitting that you were wrong can feel like losing something. But in reality it is the opposite. Because the moment a person chooses truth over ego, everything begins to shift, not instantly but steadily, as clarity replaces confusion, direction replaces uncertainty, and the heart begins to settle into something deeper than temporary confidence. It finds peace. And this is something Pharaoh never allowed himself to experience, because he held on to pride until the very end, until there was no time left to choose differently. And that is why this story is not only about his punishment. It is about a decision. A decision that appears in everyday moments, in quiet situations, in choices that no one else sees, where a person either moves closer to truth or further away from it. And as you reflect on this, as you recognize how subtle this path can be, another question begins to form, not about Pharaoh but about yourself. When truth challenges you, do you accept it? Or do you resist it until it becomes too late? And as this question begins to settle more deeply, something shifts from simple reflection into real responsibility, because at this point it is no longer only about understanding the warning, it becomes about what you choose to do with it, and this is where the story reaches its most important turning point, not in what happened to Pharaoh, but in what happens after you hear it and how it begins to shape your decisions. Because knowledge on its own does not change a person, it only opens the door. Action is what makes the difference. And this is where many people struggle, not because they do not understand but because acting requires effort, honesty, and the willingness to change something within themselves. It is always easier to listen than to change, easier to agree than to act, easier to feel something for a moment than to carry that feeling into real life. And slowly that feeling begins to fade. The reminder becomes distant. And everything returns to normal. But this is exactly what the warning is meant to prevent, because these moments are not meant to pass without impact, they are meant to create a shift that stays, something that continues to guide your choices even after the emotion disappears. And that only happens when a person responds, not later but in the present moment. Because delay is one of the most dangerous habits. It tells you there is always more time, another chance, another moment. And without realizing it, a person begins to postpone what truly matters, not rejecting it, but pushing it further away until it slowly loses its place in their life. And time does not stop for that delay, it continues moving forward, quietly and consistently, until the opportunity that once felt available is no longer there. And this is the reality the story of Pharaoh makes clear. Because he did not reject forever. He believed, eventually, but it happened too late. And timing changes everything. Because truth accepted at the wrong moment does not carry the same weight, it does not create the same outcome, and this is why awareness is not something to delay, it is something to act upon while there is still time. And this is where real strength begins to show. Not in controlling others, but in controlling yourself. In the ability to pause when it is easier to continue, to reflect when it is uncomfortable, and to correct your direction before it becomes fixed. And this does not happen in one big moment, it happens in small decisions, in private choices, in actions that no one else sees. Because a person changes step by step, choice by choice. And every decision carries direction. It either brings you closer to what is right or slowly takes you away from it, and without awareness that distance can grow without being noticed. That is why reflection is so important, because without it, a person can continue moving forward while drifting internally, losing focus without realizing it. And this drift does not feel dramatic. It feels normal. And that is what makes it dangerous. Because the most powerful changes are often the quiet ones, the ones that do not demand attention until their impact becomes too strong to ignore. And by that point, turning back becomes more difficult, not impossible, but harder than it needed to be. And this is where hope remains. Because as long as you are aware, as long as you are willing to be honest with yourself, there is always a way to realign, always a way to return, always a chance to choose differently. And that choice does not require perfection. It requires direction, the willingness to correct yourself again and again, to not let pride stop you, to not let delay control you, and to not let distraction pull you away from what truly matters. And as this understanding settles within you, something becomes clear. Knowing is not enough. You have to act. Because in the end, the difference between hearing a warning and becoming a different person is what you choose to do next. And when all of this begins to come together, when the story, the warning, and the reflection all settle into one place, something changes, not outside but within you, because at this point it is no longer just about Pharaoh, it is no longer just about what happened in the past, it becomes about you, your direction, and the center around which your life is built. And this is where the final meaning reveals itself, not as something complicated, but as something clear and undeniable. A life without a true center will always feel unstable, no matter how much it grows. And a heart without direction will always feel empty, no matter how much it gains. Because everything in this world can be taken away, everything can change, everything can disappear, but what you build your life on is what determines whether you remain steady or fall apart when that moment comes. And this is the lesson that remains long after the story ends, the part that stays with you, not as information but as awareness. Because Pharaoh had everything, and it still meant nothing in the end. Not because those things had no value, but because they were never meant to be the foundation. They were never meant to be the center. And when something temporary becomes your center, your stability becomes temporary as well. And this is where everything becomes simple. Not easy, but clear. Because the question is no longer about what happened to him. It is about what is happening within you. What are you building your life around? What defines your decisions? What controls your direction? And these are not questions that need quick answers. They need honest ones. Because honesty is where change begins. And this is where many people hesitate, not because they do not understand, but because they are not ready to face what they might find, not ready to admit that something needs to change, not ready to let go of what feels comfortable even if it is not correct. But this is where real growth begins. Not in comfort, but in truth. And truth has a way of reshaping everything, slowly but powerfully, once you allow it in, once you stop resisting it, once you choose it over ego, over habit, over distraction. And this choice does not happen once, it happens again and again, in small moments, in daily decisions, in quiet situations where no one else is watching. And that is what defines a person. Not one big moment, but consistent direction. Because no matter how far someone has drifted, there is always a way back, always a point where awareness can turn into action, where reflection can turn into change, and that moment is not in the past and not in the future. It is now, right here. And what you do with it is what shapes everything that comes next. And this is why the story was never meant to be forgotten, because it is not only about the fall of a tyrant, it is about the rise of awareness, about the chance to choose differently, to center your life around what does not change, around what remains true no matter how much the world shifts around it. And when that center is found, something settles within you. Not because life becomes easy, but because your direction becomes clear. And that clarity brings a kind of peace that does not depend on circumstances, a kind of strength that does not come from control, but from alignment, from knowing where you stand and what you follow. And in that moment, everything begins to make sense. Because you are no longer moving without purpose. You are no longer searching without direction. You are no longer chasing things that cannot satisfy you. You are moving with awareness, with intention, with a heart that knows where it belongs. And that is the difference between hearing a story and becoming someone who learns from it.